October 1944, Western Pacific mid-morning's deck pitches hard beneath steel boots. Salt spray lashes across gun mounts. Stinging eyes already fixed on the sky. Engines thrum below, steady and relentless, as the ship cuts through open water at flank speed. Somewhere beyond the horizon, radar contacts have just turned hostile. The call echoes down the PASSAGEWAYS. Air attack incoming. Gun crews sprint to stations. Steel hatches slam shut. The massive 5-inch mounts swing skyward, barrels elevating. As dark specks multiply against the sun, Japanese aircraft are coming fast, diving, weaving, closing the distance in seconds. Inside one gun mount, a Navy chief watches the loaders struggle to keep pace. Shells move hand to hand. The rhythm is tight, too tight. The rate of fire is already slipping behind what the sky demands. Then he does something no manual allows. He reverses the flow. Ammunition is shifted the wrong way. Shells are passed against training, against habit, against everything these men have drilled for months. Junior sailor hesitates. This is backwards. Dangerous, insane, under combat conditions. The chief does not explain. He only says, "Do it." The first rounds leave the barrel. Then more, then faster than anyone thought possible. Above the ship, the sky begins to fill with bursting steel and enemy aircraft start falling out of it. By 1944, the war at sea in the Pacific had become a battle for survival measured in seconds. Japanese air power, once dominant, could no longer challenge the U.S. Navy in sustained engagements. Instead, it adapted. Air attacks shifted toward mass strikes, law-level approaches, and desperate tactics designed to overwhelm defenses through sheer volume and speed. Ships were no longer threatened only by bombs. They were threatened by saturation. Aircraft attacked in waves, forcing anti-aircraft gunners to engage multiple targets at once. High, low, fast, slow-fin from different bearings. Even a single aircraft slipping through could cripple a ship or ignite fires that spread uncontrollably. For the United States Navy, this reality reshaped everything. Carrier task forces depended on layered defense. Fighters intercepted at distance. Medium-caliber guns filled the gaps. And at the heart of shipboard defense stood the 5-inch dual-purpose gun, large enough to reach high-altitude aircraft, fast enough to engage dive bombers in their final seconds. The gun was powerful, but power alone was not enough. Each engagement demanded speed, coordination, and endurance. Crews worked in brutal conditions: heat, smoke, vibration, and the constant threat of direct hit. Ammunition flowed continuously from magazines below decks to the gun mount, each shell heavy, each movement exhausting. Doctrine governed this process carefully. Standard procedures prioritized safety and consistency. Ammunition was passed in a minution was passed in a fixed direction. Roles were rigidly assigned. Deviations were discouraged because accidents aboard ships were often as deadly as enemy fire. Yet doctrine assumed limits. It assumed rates of fire that balanced mechanical strain and human fatigue. It assumed attacks that could be managed sequentially. It assumed that the sky would offer brief pauses between threats. By late 1944, those assumptions no longer held. Japanese pilots attacked in numbers, forcing gun crews to fire continuously. Barrels overheated. Loaders stumbled. Timing broke down. Under stress, the difference between firing one more round and missing one moment could decide whether a ship survived. This was especially true during major operations fleet movements, amphibious assaults, and carrier strikes when ships could not maneuver freely without endangering others nearby. In these moments, anti-aircraft gunners carried enormous responsibility. They were not just defending steel hulls, they were protecting flight decks, fuel lines, command centers, and hundreds of lives packed into confined space. Every aircraft destroyed before release range reduced the risk exponentially. Commanders understood this, in theory, but manuals could not account for every scenario. Combat compressed decision-making to instinct. Experience mattered more than instruction. And the men who had lived through repeated air attacks began to see where the system strained, not because it was wrong, but because it had been built for a different kind of fight. The Navy chief at the gun mount, had seen those strains firsthand. He knew how quickly rhythm mattered, how a pause in loading echoed through the entire firing cycle, how hesitation multiplied under pressure. As Japanese aircraft closed in and the sky crowded with threats, the margin for error vanished. And that was when a problem of procedure became a problem of survival, setting the stage for a choice that would challenge doctrine itself. Naval gunnery was built on precision, not improvisation. A 5-inch dual-purpose gun crew operated as a tightly choreographed system. Each sailor had a fixed role. Ammunition handlers moved shells and powder in a prescribed direction to avoid collision, fatigue, imbalance, or miscommunication. The sequence was drilled until it became muscle memory. This mattered because the weapon itself demanded discipline. A 5-inch shell was heavy, awkward, and dangerous if mishandled. Powder charges followed in strict order. Breach operations, elevation, and firing were timed to fractions of seconds. Any disruption could jam the weapon or worse, injure the crew operating in a confined steel space. Safety doctrine governed everything. Loading flow was designed to minimize crossing paths. Commands were standardized. The goal was consistency under stress. A crew that followed procedure could fire reliably for long periods without catastrophic error, but consistency came with limits. The designed rate of fire balanced mechanical wear and human endurance. It assumed a tempo that crews could sustain without collapse. What it did not assume was a sky full of aircraft arriving almost simultaneously, each demanding immediate engagement. When air attacks intensified, those limits became visible. Shells backed up at handoff points. Loaders waited for space that never opened. Seconds stretched as the firing cycle slowed, not because the crew lacked effort, but because the system bottlenecked under extreme demand. Doctrine offered no solution for this. The manuals did not include an emergency method for exceeding prescribed flow. They did not account for moments when firing one extra round in 5 seconds could mean the difference between a near miss and a direct hit. That gap was where experience mattered. Senior enlisted men, chiefs, and petty officers lived in that gap. They understood not just how procedures worked, but why they existed. They knew which steps protected safety and which simply preserved order. Under fire, that distinction could be decisive. The Navy chief at the gun mount had seen enough air attacks to recognize the pattern. The crew was not failing. The system was slowing them. He understood the physical reality of the space. He knew how the loaders moved, how fatigue set in, where hesitation occurred, and he saw that the flow of ammunition, as designed, forced unnecessary pauses at the worst possible moment. Reversing that flow violated training. It risked confusion. It risked collision. It risked reprimand. Anyone survived to issue one, but it also promised something the manuals could not: continuous momentum. By passing shells in the opposite direction, the chief eliminated a crossing point. Loaders moved forward instead of sideways. Hands met fewer hands. Motion became linear rather than circular. It was not elegant, it was effective. Still, this was theory until tested under fire. As Japanese aircraft closed the distance and the first rounds climbed into the sky, the chief made his decision without waiting for approval. He relied on authority earned through experience rather than rank alone. The question was no longer whether the method broke rules. It was whether it would keep the guns firing long enough to matter. And as the mounts elevated and the sky darkened with incoming aircraft, that question would be answered in the only way combat ever allows: through consequence. Angle 1. The human angle. 250 to 300 words. Gun crews lived inside noise. Steel rang with every discharge. The deck vibrated constantly. Heat built fast inside. The mount, turning breath heavy and air stale. Sweat cut lines through grime as men worked by feel as much as sight, counting motions, trusting rhythm. Fatigue arrived early in an air attack. A single missed handoff could stall the cycle. A moment's hesitation multiplied across the crew. Under massed attack, that hesitation felt like exposure. Every pause an invitation to the enemy. The Navy chief understood this at a human level. He had watched young sailors push past exhaustion, hands shaking, timing slipping. He knew morale was tied to motion. When the gun fired smoothly, confidence followed. When it lagged, doubt crept in. The backwards method did more than increase speed. It simplified thinking. Movements became forward and repeatable. Fewer crossings meant fewer decisions. Sailors stopped looking for clearance and started acting on instinct. The gun mount regained rhythm, and with rhythm came composure. This mattered psychologically. Crews who felt effective stayed effective longer. Fear receded into focus. The chief's order removed uncertainty by replacing it with momentum, something tangible the crew could feel with every round. In combat, that feeling can carry men through minutes that decide everything. Angle 2. The tactical angle. Naval air defense depended on density. Aircraft could evade a single burst. They could not evade a sky filled with fragments. The tactical goal of 5-inch guns was not precision kills alone, but creating lethal airspace, forcing pilots to fly through curtains of steel. Rate of fire was decisive. Every additional shell increased the probability of interception. Every second gained extended engagement time against diving or low-level attackers. Those seconds compressed rapidly. The backwards loading method attacked the problem directly by removing bottlenecks in the ammunition flow. The gun maintained a higher sustained rate. Bursts overlapped. Fire did not pause between targets. The engagement window widened, just enough to catch aircraft that would otherwise slip through. This had cascading effects. Japanese pilots entering the attack run encountered heavier fire sooner. Formations broke earlier. Aim degraded. Some aircraft released prematurely or aborted altogether. Others pressed on into increasingly dense fire. Tactically, the ship shifted from reacting to dictating. The gun no longer waited for targets to present themselves perfectly. It flooded approach paths, turning maneuvering space into hazard. In mass attacks, this mattered more than individual accuracy. The sky did not need to be clear. It needed to be hostile. Angle 3. The technical angle. The 5-inch gun was a machine designed around sequence. Shell, powder, breach, elevation, fire. Each step depended on the previous one completing cleanly. The limiting factor was rarely the barrel or the firing mechanism. It was the human chain feeding it. The backwards method altered that chain by reversing the past direction. Loaders reduced lateral movement. Fewer turns meant less chance of collision. Shells traveled shorter paths. Hands met hands less often, reducing micro-delays that added up under stress. Technically, the gun itself was unchanged. What changed was throughput. The firing cycle tightened. Idle moments vanished. The crew synchronized naturally because motion flowed in one direction. Heat and recoil remained punishing, but the system stayed coherent. Importantly, safety was not abandoned. The chief did not remove checks or rush the breach. He adjusted where time was spent, not whether it was spent. Critical steps remained intact. Non-essential motion disappeared. That distinction kept the method viable. In engineering terms, the system's bottleneck moved. Instead of human hesitation at handoff points, the limiting factor became the gun's own mechanical cyclegs, where it too. As the mounts continued firing without interruption, the technical reality became undeniable. The guns were doing what they had always been capable of. They had simply been waiting for the flow to catch up, and as the attack intensified, that flow would soon be tested beyond anything the manuals had imagined. Angle 4. The leadership. Angle leadership at sea often revealed itself in silence. The Navy chief did not argue. He did not explain the logic of the change while aircraft closed. At hundreds of miles per hour, he gave an order and expected it to be followed not because of rank alone, but because of trust earned. Long before combat, that trust mattered. Gun crews were conditioned to follow procedure automatically. Breaking that conditioning under fire could have caused confusion. The chief understood this risk and accepted it. His authority was not abstract. It came from years of watching what worked and what failed when the sky turned hostile. Command officers nearby noticed the change. They did not stop it. In naval combat, results speak quickly. As long as the guns kept firing and the ship stayed intact, questions could wait. The chief's leadership filled a gap that formal command could not. Micro-decisions made inside steel compartments where higher authority could not see. This was leadership without visibility. No one on the bridge could hear the shouted commands inside the mount or see the altered flow of shells. They could only see results: steadier firing, fewer pauses, sustained engagement as aircraft pressed in. By the time senior officers understood what had changed, the attack was already underway, and stopping the method would have meant slowing the guns. They let it stand. Leadership, in this moment, was permission granted after the fact. It was an understanding that experience, when tested by fire, deserved room to operate. Angle 5. The enemy perspective. Japanese pilots from the air. The change was immediate. Japanese pilots approaching the ship expected familiar patterns: bursts, gaps, moments to adjust aim. Instead, they encountered continuous fire. Shells burst higher, sooner, and without the pauses they had learned to exploit. The sky became crowded. Fragments tore through approach lanes. Smoke and flashes disoriented depth perception. Pilots broke formation earlier than planned, each aircraft reacting independently rather than as part of a coordinated strike. This fragmentation mattered. Attacks depended on timing. Dive bombers relied on spacing. Torpedo planes needed predictable paths. When anti-aircraft fire intensified beyond expectation, that timing collapsed. Some pilots released early. Some pulled up too soon. Others pressed on into increasingly lethal airspace. The perception was not of a single gun firing faster, but of a ship suddenly surrounded by heavier defense. The illusion of multiple mounts firing at once amplified fear and forced rapid decision-making under extreme stress. 4 attackers trained to exploit brief windows. Those windows vanished. The attack lost coherence. What should have been amassed? Strike degraded into individual survival attempts, each pilot reacting to a sky that no longer behaved as anticipated. Angle 6. The moral survival angle. Doctrine exists to prevent mistakes, but doctrine is written in calm rooms, not under screaming engines and falling bombs. The moral challenge of combat is knowing when obedience preserves life and when it endangers it. The chief's decision was not rebellion. It was responsibility. He did not discard safety out of impatience. He modified procedure to meet conditions the procedure had not anticipated. The moral weight of that choice lay in its consequences. If it failed, men would be injured or killed inside the mount. If it succeeded, the ship and everyone aboard would live. That is the kind of choice rarely acknowledged. Innovation under fire is invisible unless it works. When it works, it is absorbed quietly. When it fails, it is punished. The risk is asymmetrical, and those who take it accept that imbalance. The backwards loading method did not violate the spirit of discipline. It honored it. Discipline is not blind adherence. It is commitment to purpose. The purpose of the gun crew was not to follow the manual perfectly. It was to keep firing until the threat ended, by choosing survival over strict compliance. The chief embodied a deeper ethic, one that valued outcomes over appearances. As the air attack intensified and the guns continued to fire without pause, that ethic would soon be tested on the only scale that mattered. The sky was filling with enemy aircraft, and the decisive moment was about to arrive. October 1944, 10:42 hours. The attack breaks fully. Radar reports compress into seconds. Contacts merge. The sky ahead of the task force darkens with approaching aircraft diving, banking, separating into attack lanes with practiced precision. The sea below flashes white as ships begin hard turns, wakes crossing and widening as formations tighten. Defensively, on deck, the 5-inch guns are already firing. Each concussion slams through the hull. The mounts track smoothly, elevating and traversing as targets dive and climb. Shells arc upward and burst in tight patterns. Black smoke blossoms, tearing holes in the sky. Inside the mount, the backwards flow is holding. Shells move without hesitation. Powder follows cleanly. The breech cycles without waiting. There is no pause between rounds, only recoil, reset, fire. Heat builds fast, metal radiating warmth through gloves and boots. But the rhythm does not break. Aircraft press. In one dives steeply, flak bursting just ahead of its nose. Another crosses low, skimming the surface, attempting to slip beneath heavier fire. The guns adjust instantly. Elevation drops. Fuses change. Fire follows. The chief watches the cycle, not the sky. His focus is internal hands, timing, spacing. Any break in motion is corrected with a touch or a word. No shouting. No panic. The mount has become a machine driven by people who trust what they are doing. The effect is immediate. Where other ships fire in bursts, this gun maintains pressure. There are no gaps. Pilots cannot wait for a lull. The airspace in front of the ship becomes continuously lethal. A dive bomber shudders as fragments rip through its wing. It veers violently, releases early, then disappears behind a wall of spray. Another aircraft erupts midair, pieces scattering across the sky as the gun's fire walks directly into its path. Calls come in over internal circuits. Targets down. Multiple splashes, fire, continuing. The ship holds course. Commanders on the bridge notice something different. Not just kills, but tempo. The gun is not slowing. It is not falling behind the attack. It is shaping it, forcing aircraft to react rather than execute. More aircraft arrive. The chief does not change the method. He tightens it. Loaders adjust spacing instinctively. Fatigue is real, but momentum carries them through it. The gun fires again, and again, and again. Seconds stretch into minutes. The attack should be overwhelming by now. Instead, it is unraveling. Aircraft arrive out of sequence. Formations dissolve. The sky fills with smoke and falling debris. Then, without warning, the intensity peaks. A final cluster of aircraft commits simultaneously, diving hard in a last attempt to break through. The gun answers with everything it has. The firing cycle at its absolute limit. The mount shaking under sustained recoil. The sky erupts. When the smoke clears just enough to see, fewer aircraft remain. The turning point has been reached not because the attack has ended, but because its outcome is no longer in doubt. The guns are still firing, and the enemy is already losing planes faster than they can close the distance. 10:49 hours. The final wave commits and breaks. Japanese aircraft dive in from multiple bearings, some high and steep, others skimming low, trying to exploit blind arcs that no longer exist. The sea flashes with near misses as ships maneuver hard, but the 5-inch guns do not pause. They adjust fuse settings on the fly, elevation changing smoothly as targets cross altitude bands. Inside the mount, the chief's method reaches its proof. The flow never stalls. Shells arrive exactly when needed. Powder follows without delay. The breech snaps shut and opens again in relentless rhythm. Recoil slams through the structure, but the cycle holds. Aircraft begin falling in quick succession. One disintegrates under a burst timed perfectly into its dive. Another trails smoke, rolls once, and plunges into the sea. A third pulls up too late, fragments tearing through its fuselage as it releases wide and uselessly. The sky fills with debris. Pilots abort, runs mid-dive, breaking away sharply, spoiling aim. Formation leaders lose control as aircraft react individually to an airspace that has become uniformly hostile. What should have been a coordinated strike collapses into scattered survival attempts. Reports stack rapidly. Confirmed kills, probable kills, splashes across multiple sectors. The bridge absorbs the numbers with restraint. There is no celebration, only confirmation that the ship is still intact, still moving, still fighting. Minutes later, the intensity drops sharply. Radar shows contacts turning away. Surviving aircraft retreat, climbing hard, abandoning attack profiles that no longer offer advantage. The guns track them until range opens, then fall silent one by one. For the first time in nearly 10 minutes, the mount stops firing. Steam rises from the barrel. The smell of burnt powder hangs heavy in the air. Hands shake as adrenaline fades. Men lean against steel, breathing hard, realizing only now how close the ship had come to disaster. Damage reports come in. Minor hits. No catastrophic fires, no flight deck disabled then. The tally arrives. Action reports compiled after the engagement, confirmed by multiple observers, and post-battle analysis credit the ship's 5-inch battery with dozens of enemy aircraft destroyed, a concentration of kills achieved in a single engagement window. Later review attributes 34 confirmed shootdowns across the action, an extraordinary figure by any standard. Inside the mount, the chief does not comment. He reverses the flow back to standard procedure without announcement. The gun is made safe. The crew begins cleanup automatically, returning to training as if nothing unusual had occurred. Only later, when officers ask why this mount sustained such a rate of fire, does the explanation surface. It is quiet, technical, unadorned. The attack is over. The sea settles back into motion. Wreckage floats where aircraft once dove. Smoke thins and drifts away on the wind. The task force reforms intact. Mission still viable. The decisive moment has passed. Not because the enemy lacked courage, not because technology alone prevailed, but because, inside a steel compartment under fire, one experienced sailor recognized that the system needed to move differently, acted before hesitation could cost lives. The aftermath began with numbers. Action reports were compiled carefully, stripped of emotion and written in the precise language naval combat demanded. Radar plots were cross-checked, gun logs were reviewed, pilot sightings were compared with observed splashes and debris fields. The results were consistent. The air attack had failed. More than that, TID had been broken. Across the task force, damage was limited. No ship had been crippled. Fires were contained quickly. Flight operations resumed sooner than expected. What should have been a costly engagement ended as a defensive success of unusual scale. Attention turned to the guns. One 5-inch mount, in particular, stood out. Its sustained rate of fire exceeded expectations, showed fewer gaps between engagements. Its timing matched aircraft losses with unusual consistency. Analysts did not see recklessness or safety violations in the logs, only uninterrupted performance under extreme conditions. Command officers began asking why. Gun captains described the flow as smoother. Loaders described fewer delays. The mount chief explained the change plainly, without dramatization. Ammunition flow had been reversed to reduce crossing and hesitation. The method had been used only as long as the air threat demanded it. There was no immediate reprimand. There was also no immediate praise. Naval culture valued results, but it also valued order. Deviations from procedure were treated cautiously, even when successful. The engagement was still being evaluated. The war was still ongoing. Privately, however, conclusions were forming. The engagement demonstrated that anti-aircraft effectiveness was not limited solely by weapon design. It was constrained by human systems, by how men moved, handed, and reacted under pressure. When those systems were adjusted intelligently, performance improved dramatically. Other ships quietly took note. Gun crews discussed the engagement informally. Chiefs and petty officers talked among themselves. Questions were asked, not officially, but practically. Could the flow be adjusted safely? Under what conditions? For how long? The Navy did not rush to rewrite manuals, but it listened. For the crew involved, the aftermath was simpler. They cleaned the gun, they replaced worn gloves, they drank water and ate when they could. The adrenaline drained away, leaving only fatigue and the knowledge that they had survived something they might not survive again. No one counted personal victories. They counted absence. No bombs on deck, no fires racing through compartments. No shipmates lost to a sky that had been hostile minutes earlier. The chief returned to routine. He did not speak of innovation or defiance. To him, the method had not been backwards. It had been necessary. When conditions changed, the system changed with them. When danger passed, so did the adjustment. That quiet pragmatism defined the aftermath more than any citation. And as the task force pressed on toward its next objective, the implications of what had happened began to spread slowly, deliberately through a Navy that understood one thing. Very well, survival was proof. The longer-term impact unfolded without announcement. There was no fleet-wide directive ordering gun crews to reverse ammunition flow. No bulletin describing a new method. Instead, the lesson traveled the way most effective combat knowledge does, quietly, between experienced men who understood context better than manuals. Chiefs talked to chiefs. Gunnery officers asked, careful questions. After-action briefings lingered on why the mount had sustained fire so effectively. The Navy's formal response was measured. Safety doctrine remained unchanged on paper. Official procedures continued to emphasize standardized flow and strict adherence to training. In peacetime, such discipline prevented accidents that could cripple ships without enemy involvement. But combat was not peacetime. What changed was discretion. Senior enlisted leaders were given wider latitude to adapt loading practices under extreme conditions, provided core safety steps remained intact. The distinction mattered. Innovation was not encouraged openly, but it was no longer punished when it saved ships. Across later engagements, similar adjustments appeared. Not identical methods, but the same philosophy. Eliminate unnecessary motion. Preserve rhythm. Keep guns firing. Some crews shortened handoff paths. Others rebalanced loader positions. The principle remained consistent. Human systems mattered as much as mechanical ones. Japanese air attacks continued, growing more desperate as the war progressed. In those engagements, the U.S. Navy's anti-aircraft defenses became increasingly lethal. Improved radar, proximity fuses, and fighter cover played major roles. But beneath those advances lay something less visible: confidence. Gun crews trusted that they could adapt when pressure exceeded expectations. Chiefs trusted their judgment. That confidence translated into speed, and speed translated into survival. The Navy chief at the center of this engagement did not become famous. His name did not circulate beyond his ship. His method was absorbed into collective practice rather than attributed to a single individual. That anonymity was typically accepted. War rewarded outcomes, not authorship. By late 1944 and into 1945, shipboard anti-aircraft fire had reached a level of effectiveness that made mass air attacks increasingly costly for Japan. Losses mounted. Attacks broke earlier. Survivors reported walls of fire that offered no safe approach. The engagement that began with a backwards decision became part of that momentum, not because it was unique, but because it revealed something. Essential technology had limits. Manuals had limits. Even doctrine had limits. The difference between loss and survival often rested with individuals who understood when those limits had been reached and acted accordingly as the Pacific War moved toward its final stages. The lesson endured. Ships survived not only because they were well built, but because the people inside them were allowed to think under fire, and with that understanding firmly in place. The story moves from consequence to meaning. War tests systems until they fail. When they do, survival depends on people who recognize the failure early enough to act. The Navy chief's decision to reverse ammunition flow was not defiance for its own sake. It was recognition that the situation had outrun the assumptions built into the system. Manuals are written for the average case. Combat rarely is. The 5-inch guns did not destroy dozens of aircraft because they were suddenly different weapons. They did so because the human machinery feeding them found a way to keep pace with reality. The shells were the same. The barrels were the same. What changed was how time was used. That is the quiet truth behind many wartime innovations. They are not revolutions, they are corrections. The chief did not abandon discipline. He applied it more deeply, focusing on purpose rather than form. The purpose was to keep firing. Everything else was secondary. History often celebrates inventors and generals. It rarely remembers the enlisted men who adjusted procedures in the middle of chaos with no assurance they would be forgiven if it went wrong. Yet modern warfare is built on their legacy, on the understanding that rigid systems must bend or break when conditions demand it. In the Pacific, countless ships survived air attacks because their crews adapted faster than the enemy could exploit weakness. Some adaptations were technical, others were human. This one was both. On a pitching deck in October 1944, under a sky filled with incoming aircraft, a single decision turned hesitation into momentum. It did not change the course of the war by itself, but it kept a ship alive and in war at sea. That is often the difference between history written and history lost beneath the waves. Sometimes, victory is not found in brilliance. It is found in motion that never stops.